Welcome to the Watch Symposia series. I'm Steve Rogenstein, based in Berlin, Germany. Honeybee Watch's project director and your host today. And our co-host is Arrigo Moro, the science director of Honeybee Watch. So to introduce today's symposium, it's titled Are Wild Honeybees Wild Bees Too? And some of you find that to be a very obvious question, very rhetorical, but there's controversy around this, and that's something that we hope to discuss and explore today. So with all of our topics, we try to have our finger on the pulse and explore issues relevant to our field of study, namely around free-living honeybees, and really kind of address these topics that colleagues are talking about or are challenged by. For this one in particular, we wanted to confront an issue head on and not shrink from its potential controversy. And that is the notion that honeybees are competing with other bee species for resources, namely nectar and pollen. I see, Rebecca, you nodding your head, and you know all about this with the melipona in Yucatan. Um, so as we dove deeper into this issue, its complexity became really clear. So intertwined with the issue of competition are these other kind of sub-issues of native versus alien, the degree of honeybees' invasiveness in different geographic settings. Jamie is representing the Americas. We have Kit, who's representing Australia. These are lands that are not the original geographic range of Apis mellifera. So they are, non-native, invasive, call it what you may, but that's not where they came from. So there's a level of kind of controversy there. And then also another one of these sub-issues is their effects on other species. So in this 2-hour symposium, obviously we're not going to get enough time to dive deep into all of these subtopics and try to unpack all these layers. It's not going to happen. So what we'll do though is with these 3 experts, we hope that they represent a diversity of perspectives, expertise, and opinions. And through especially the panel discussion, we hope to ask questions that really target the issues. So I'd like to introduce Kit Prendergast. I've been following her social media for a while, so I was familiar with her research on native bees at Curtin University and elsewhere, and also her stance on honeybees. In full disclosure, putting words in her mouth, she's not necessarily a fan of them, at least not in her native Australia, where they're an introduced species. Although knowing that, I still attempted to promote our last symposium about tree cavities on our Facebook group page, but unfortunately got rejected with a note citing that their page was devoted to bees other than Apis mellifera. And me, being me, not wanting to accept no at face value, I sent an appeal and stated that Honeybee Watch focuses on free living and not managed honeybees. And surprisingly, she consented to post our announcement. So thank you for that. And at which time an idea was planted. Despite her vocal opposition to honeybees, the fact that she was open to disseminating information about wild colonies convinced me that she'd be a great panelist for this particular symposium. We invited her. She miraculously and graciously accepted. And even though it's so late there in Australia, and that's how she came to be with us today. So Kit, thank you for staying up so late and for boldly representing a perspective that may potentially challenge some of us here at Honeybee Watch. So if you could share your screen, I'm going to give you 15 minutes on the timer. I'll tell you when there is 1 minute left so that you have an opportunity to wrap up. And my apologies in advance for interrupting you. But if you can unmute yourself, let's start. You ready?
All right, thanks for inviting me to talk about my research on the rather controversial topic of honeybees versus native bees. It is definitely a very sticky topic with many opinions. I'm not fully against honeybees, but I believe that they need to be managed sustainably, and especially in places where they are an introduced species. So let's get into it. Oh, okay. So, um, as I said, there's a lot of opinions. So, for example, in popular media, we hear about honeybee apocalypse and that honeybees are going to go extinct very soon. But then when we look at like published scientific articles, there's actually an uptrend in global managed honeybee colonies. So there's a big disconnect between what you might see in popular media and then what's actually studied and published in the scientific literature. And yeah, there's a lot of social media about honeybees, but then when it comes to the other bees of the world, of which there's 20,000 species, there's a lot less attention. And I'm from Australia, and honeybees are an introduced species here. So they've been introduced for about 100 years in both managed colonies and feral colonies. And just to make the distinction, so wild animals are animals that are in the wild in their native environment. Feral animals are managed animals that are in the wild. So if we think of cats, domesticated species, when they're in the wild, they're feral. Um, Cattle that escape into national parks become feral. So yeah, there's that distinction. Whether something's feral or wild depends on where you are in the world. So honeybees can potentially impact native bees. So competition occurs when two species have similar resource requirements and they can compete physically or by a resource competition where the dominant competitor outcompetes the other one by taking more resources than can sustain the other competitors' populations. And competition is especially prevalent when there's few resources. So competition depends on the carrying capacity of the environment. When there's fewer resources for one species that's being outcompeted, it means it can't eat as much, it can't reproduce as much, so less reproductive output, which can translate into population declines, even local extinctions. And then looking at it from more than a two species perspective in a ecosystem perspective, when we're talking about bees interacting with flowers, if there's a dominant competitor inserted into an ecosystem, it can disrupt pollination networks. And that's what I wanted to study, among many other things, for my PhD. So what I did was I conducted research in 14 sites in southwest Western Australia, which is a biodiversity hotspot, so really important for biodiversity. I recorded honeybees, native bees, the plants they visited. I wanted to know, do honeybees affect pollination networks, and are they competing with native bees? So these are the publications from that research if you want to read the whole thing, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a summary now. So I found that the introduced honeybee occupied different roles than native bees and pollination networks. Honeybees in those graphs, which are interaction network graphs, are in the red, and you can see that they dominated. And they forage on more plant species because they are a super general species, whereas here in Southwest Asia, we've got specialized plant pollinator relationships. Some species can only forage on plants in just one genus, so they don't have the opportunity to switch plants. And so, yeah, honeybees dominated many of the interactions, especially in residential gardens. So I was looking at residential gardens as well as remnant vegetation in urban areas. And they differed in their roles in the ecosystem. They visited more plant species. They also visited way more exotic plants. And so this meant that when you look at the different metrics in a pollination network, they occupied different roles. They were less reliant on plants. As I mentioned, many of our native bees strongly rely on a particular few plants. And honeybees were less specific in their interactions. Because they visited more plants in higher abundances, they had a higher what's called pollination service index, and the variation in honeybee specialization was much wider as well. So you can see that they stood out very clearly from the rest of the other native bee taxa. They also altered the network properties. They made them less connected, which can lead to instability. They meant that with the honeybees, the native bees had to forage on different resources when there were more honeybees to try and reduce competition. Honeybees made networks more generalized, and there was also more overlap in resources. But how about, so that was the networks. How do the honeybees affect native bee abundance and diversity? So looking overall, association between honeybee abundance and native bee abundance, there was no association, but a positive association in gardens. Year 2, no association, but a negative association, which means that the effect of honeybee abundance varies between years, which can be due to variation in flowering resource due to weather, and also the types of habitats. When we looked at species richness, positive relationship, year 2, negative relationship, again telling us that the environment and environmental conditions really impact whether there's competition or not. But this is a very coarse, broad level scale of detail. So typically the sort of typical advice we get is plant more plant species, and that's better for native bee diversity. But that depends very much on what plants you're planting. And I found that the more plant species there were, the more likely honeybees were going to negatively impact native bees. And that's because, especially in urban habitats, most of the plants are exotics. Honeybees can forage on all these exotics. There's less native plants for the native bees, and it means that they have fewer plants that they can forage on. And you're boosting honeybee abundance with this diversity of flowers, meaning that there's greater competitive pressure. And when I looked at species traits which can influence competition, smaller bees positively associated because they need smaller resource requirements. So when there's more resources in the environment, honeybees benefit, native bees benefit. They can coexist. The larger bees, though, they have higher resource requirements. And so when there's lots of honeybees, they're taking away more resources. The larger body bees are negatively impacted. And then in line with competition theory, taxa that had the same foraging preferences, wanted the same plants as honeybees, they were negatively impacted. Species that foraged on different flower species had different preferences, less affected. And then looking at what taxa are most vulnerable, Hylaean bees. Now, Myrtaceae is a plant species in Australia that's quite dominant, and native bees love it. It's got lots of nectar and lots of pollen. Honeybees really love it too. It's our main honey in Australia, and it's prized all over the world. Then species that were less vulnerable to competition were things like Amygilla. These are generalists. They can partition resources. They also buzz pollinators, and honeybees can't buzz pollinate, so they have resources that are free from competition. And Megachili, they were also less impacted. They love Fabaceae, honeybees less so. Honeybees find the keel in those sort of flowers a bit annoying to operate from my observations. And competition, again, differed by habitat. So in native areas, less so, because there's lots of native flowers for our native bees. Residential gardens, bad for native bees, good for honeybees. So there's competition there. Then I also did some research after my PhD looking at bees after bushfires. This was in 2021, and we had many fires in 2020 in Australia. And I was looking at bee hotels, and I found that in areas where there were more honeybees after fires, there were fewer bee hotels occupied and fewer native bees foraging. And this is because after the fire, there's less resources because the fire's burnt through the resources. And so there's fewer flowers. Honeybees can outcompete the native bees in those situations. I also wanted to look at what the literature as a whole has been finding. So I did a review of all the published studies in Australia. Mainly non-significant, so that means that's not statistically significant, but there were way more negative associations. So it means that competition is actually really hard to demonstrate because there's so many different variables. It's okay to demonstrate in a lab setting, but we've got so many factors operating. but it does suggest that there's more likely to be negative associations. And the literature, like my studies, suggests that the effect of competition is dependent on what species you're looking at, their traits. And then, of course, feral versus managed honeybees. Now, it's really hard to tell in the field when you're counting honeybees whether they're feral or managed, almost impossible. But these two different types of honeybees that co-occur in the same area can have different effects. So feral honeybees, it's chronic competition. They're always there. They take up hollows in trees, which in Australia is a bad thing because we don't have many hollows and we've got lots of native species that, again, declining due to habitat loss that need these hollows, like our possums and our parrots and our owls and our ducks. And then the density of honeybees that are feral, uncontrolled, and they fluctuate within the environment. They're more likely to swarm though. They're always there, but the colony health is going to vary by the environment. They also, anecdotally, are more aggressive. They've been subjected to natural selection, so they're also better adapted to the wild environment. And there's more genetic variation, which can be a good thing. With managed honeybees, though, it's acute competition. So beekeepers will put hundreds, thousands of hives into an area when there's a nectar flow. So you've got this, sudden increase in pressure, which can be really hard for our native bees can't adapt to that. They can reach very high densities, but it's also intermittent. So it'll be during a crop bloom or a eucalyptus nectar flow. They are better able to withstand conditions in the environment because beekeepers want to manage their bees so that they're healthy and they'll supplementary feed. They can be protected from disease through good management. They are selectively bred for higher nectar production though. So that's the main. Typically, now it's changed a little bit for disease resistance, but they want high nectar flow. So good foraging, good collecting of nectar. So high potential for competition. But they might be more susceptible to inbreeding depression. So this is a topic that hasn't been researched. These are just things that we know about the two, but whether feral honeybees or managed honeybees are more competitive against native bees has yet to be determined. And as I said, it's very hard to tell when you're in the field whether it's a feral or managed species. So what can we do? Because we do need honeybees everywhere because they are such good crop pollinators. They're super generalists. That's why they're not going to go extinct. That's why they're so successful all over the world. We need them for pollination, especially of introduced crop species, and they can be put in these landscapes that many of our native bees, as I mentioned, so specialized, especially in Australia, they're not going to pollinate crops because they only need a genus of native flower. So we do need native bees. In areas where there's high densities, we can reduce feral honeybee competition, especially when there's other native fauna that need hollows, for example. So we've got critically endangered possums in Australia and things like that who really need those nesting resources. We want to limit backyard beekeeping because at the moment it's unregulated, and so you can have high densities. Unlike beekeepers that manage their colonies, sometimes these backyard beekeepers go into it without knowing how to sustainably care for their honeybees, so they swarm, they can get disease, all those sorts of things. Swarm prevention courses so that we can have honeybees at densities that are sustainable in landscape. So it's all about sustainability so that there's coexistence. And we need to plant flowers that native bees prefer so that they can coexist. So that's why in the bushland remnants, when there's lots of native wildflowers, there was less competition. But when we've got landscapes that are full of exotic species, then that's going to harm the native bees by tipping the balance in the honeybee favor. I do have a number of videos about my research, and I also was a FameLab finalist talking about this honeybee competition research. If you don't know what FameLab is, it's an international competition that starts off in each country where you have 3 minutes to talk about your thesis. So it's short and sweet. And so you can see that on my YouTube channel. But that's a very brief overview of the topic of honeybee versus native bees. There's clearly so much to discuss, and ongoing research is still being conducted, but something that's really important because, as I said, we need to protect native bees. They're declining, they've gone extinct, but we also need honeybees in a way that's sustainable as well. So thank you.
Thank you, Kit. Wow, that's a lot of field work.
Yeah.
I can only imagine spending lots and lots of time in backyards and in remnant bush. What do you call them? Remnant bush?
Yeah, so we call sort of wild vegetation in Australia the bush. It's
Okay.
just a colloquial term, bushland or bush, but it's yeah, native vegetation. But that's my favorite thing to do, just to spend time looking at flowers and counting bees and seeing what diversity there is. It's very exciting.
Sounds very calming and therapeutic.
Oh yeah.
Uh, so thank you for presenting your work and introducing us to all of these facets of competition between the honeybees and the other native bees in Australia. Super interesting, and I think it'll definitely fuel the conversation that will ensue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.